Welcome back to the deep dive. I think it's safe to say that pretty much everyone's heard of the Illuminati, right?
Oh, for sure. It's one of those names that just kind of pops up everywhere these days.
Exactly. But today, we're not just talking about like late night internet conspiracies and stuff. We're going way deeper.
Much deeper.
Yeah, we're trying to understand how this real group, the historical Illuminati, even though it didn't last very long,
Right, right.
how it became this huge, almost mythical thing that still have this hold on people's imaginations even centuries later.
It really is remarkable how much the idea of the Illuminati has endured and, mutated over time.
Totally. And of course, it's all wrapped up in these big ideas, fear, this idea of hidden power, and even some pretty interesting philosophical stuff, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We're going to be getting into all of that.
So for this deep dive, we're calling it Inside the Shadows, Origins of the Real Illuminati, right?
That's right.
And what we're doing is going back to the original sources, the historical accounts, the actual research that's been done,
Uh-huh.
to try to figure out who these actual Illuminati were and how their story got so twisted and turned into this global conspiracy that, honestly, a lot of people still believe in today.
It's a wild story for sure.
It really is. So let's get right into it. Where does this whole thing really start to take off? Where do we see this story gaining real momentum?
It's really interesting when you think about the French Revolution.
Yeah, yeah.
It was such a massive event, so much upheaval, such radical change.
I mean, between 1789 and 1799, it completely reshaped Europe.
Absolutely. And in the years that followed, a lot of people, especially those who had, shall we say, more conservative viewpoints, they were really struggling to come to terms with what had happened, how it had happened, and why.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. It was such a dramatic and violent shift.
It was. It was incredibly dramatic.
And that's where we see figures like Barruel and Robison step in, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
They saw this whole world-changing event, and they're like, wait, there's got to be something bigger going on here. There must be some secret force behind all of this.
Yeah, they couldn't accept that it was just like a spontaneous uprising of the people.
Right, it had to be, like, orchestrated.
Exactly. And that's where the Illuminati come into the picture for them.
So we're talking about, like, Abbé Augustin Barruel and Jean Robison.
Yes, those are the big names. They both wrote very influential books in the late 1790s. And both of them argue that this wasn't just a revolution. It was a carefully planned operation orchestrated by this clandestine network, the Bavarian Illuminati.
And they believed that these Illuminati were, like, embedded within other groups, right?
Yeah, the theory was that they were working in secret, like infiltrating other organizations, especially the Freemasons. They were supposedly pulling the strings from within these already existing structures.
Okay, so they're looking at the French Revolution, and they see these Illuminati as the masterminds behind it. But what was their specific evidence? Like, what parts of the revolution did they point to and say, see, this is proof of the Illuminati's influence?
Okay, so their arguments rested on a few key things. First, they focused a lot on the anti-clerical policies that became really prominent during the revolution.
So, like, getting rid of the church's power and influence.
Exactly. And they saw that as directly reflecting what they knew about the Illuminati's own anti-religious views. From their writings and stuff, they seemed to be opposed to organized religion, to the power of the church, to things like that.
So the revolution's attack on the church fits with what they knew about the Illuminati. Makes sense.
Right. It seems to line up. And then they also looked at the whole idea of the rights of man.
Ah, yeah, that was a big core concept of the revolution.
It was. This whole idea of individual liberty, equality, those kinds of things. For Barruel and Robison, those revolutionary ideals were basically Illuminati doctrines being put into practice, like writ large, on a national scale.
So it wasn't just a vague feeling they had. They were trying to connect the dots between what they saw happening in France and what they believed about the Illuminati.
They were. And to be fair, from their perspective, those connections probably did seem pretty compelling at the time.
I could see that, yeah.
And you also have to remember that these were guys who had done their homework. In a way, they knew something about the Illuminati. They'd read their stuff.
Right. They weren't just making it up out of thin air.
No, they were drawing on what they knew. And then, especially John Robison, he really took the theory even further, He really went all in on it.
In what way?
So, in his book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, he claimed that all these different radical clubs, all these groups that were involved in the revolution.
Oh, yeah, there were tons of those, weren't there?
Tons. And he claimed that they were all basically pawns in a much bigger game, being manipulated by hidden figures, these unknown superiors. And he flat out identified those unknown superiors as the Illuminati.
Whoa, so he's saying that the revolution was even more orchestrated than it seemed, that it was all part of this even bigger, deeper plot controlled by the Illuminati.
Exactly. He was painting a picture of this incredibly powerful and secretive organization pulling all the strings, working in the shadows to bring about this massive change, this collapse of the old order.
And, I mean, that kind of image, that kind of idea, it must have been pretty terrifying to people at the time, especially those who were already scared of the revolution and everything it represented.
Oh, absolutely. It really resonated with people, especially in the late 1790s. This idea that the Illuminati had masterminded the whole thing, that they were behind it all, overthrowing monarchies, attacking the church. It gained a ton of traction. I mean, if you're deeply unsettled by all the violence and the radical changes, it's kind of comforting in a way to have someone to blame, you know?
To have this scapegoat, yeah, to think that it's not just chaos, it's not just the people, it's this evil group with this master plan.
Exactly. And so you see this happening over and over again in history, right? When big things happen, when societies go through these huge shifts, people often look for simple explanations, even if those explanations involve, secret societies or shadowy figures pulling the strings.
Right, right. Makes sense. It's like the human mind just needs to find a way to make sense of the chaos somehow.
I think so.
But here's the thing, right? This is where the actual historical record really throws a wrench in the works. What does modern research actually tell us about the connection between the Bavarian Illuminati and the French Revolution? Was there one?
Okay, so this is really important. The modern consensus among historians is pretty clear. There's actually no credible evidence linking the Bavarian Illuminati, and this is key, which was officially disbanded in 1787.
Oh, wow. So a couple of years before the revolution even started.
To the outbreak of the French Revolution, the timeline just doesn't match up.
Right. So the Illuminati, the real group, the one we're talking about, was already gone by the time the revolution kicked off.
Exactly. So that original conspiracy theory, the one Barruel and Robison were putting forward, it's mostly seen as just that, a theory, a conspiracy narrative. And it's a really classic example of one, too, because even though it wasn't based on solid evidence, it had a huge impact at the time. It really did help fuel this backlash against all kinds of secret societies across Europe in the years that followed.
So it's a case of a really compelling story having very real consequences, even if it wasn't actually true.
Absolutely. It's a powerful illustration of how ideas, even unfounded ones, can shape history. One of the big takeaways here is that sometimes the story itself, whether it's true or not, is almost as important as the events themselves.
That's a really interesting point. So we see this Illuminati scare taking hold in Europe, but then it jumps across the Atlantic, right?
Yeah, it does.
What happens when this whole idea of the Illuminati reaches the United States? What happens in America?
So the fear, the anxiety, it wasn't just confined to Europe. By 1798, 1799.
Right around that time.
This conspiracy theory, this idea about the Illuminati, it experiences this big resurgence, this time in New England.
New England. Interesting. So how did it make that jump? How did the idea cross the ocean?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the availability of books. Barruel and Robison's books started circulating in America, and they found this really eager audience among certain segments of American society.
Gotcha. So these ideas about the Illuminati are now starting to spread among Americans. But who were the main people who were really pushing this? Who were the kind of the alarmists, the ones who were most worried about it?
It was really driven by prominent American clergymen. Figures like Reverend Jedediah Morse.
Okay, I've heard that name.
And Timothy Dwight, who was actually the president of Yale College at the time.
Wow, so pretty influential figures.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And they read these accounts from Europe, and they were incredibly troubled by what they read. They really believed it, and they started warning their congregations, warning the public at large that Illuminati agents, actual agents, were working in secret to infiltrate a match.
Oh, wow. So they weren't just worried about the idea spreading. They thought there were actual Illuminati operatives, spies or whatever, actively working within the U.S.
That's exactly what they believed. And their goal, according to these clergymen, was to undermine Christianity in America.
That makes sense, given the Illuminati's supposed anti-religious stance.
Right. But also, they thought they were trying to undermine the government itself, the whole American experiment.
Oh, wow. So they saw this as a direct threat to the very foundations of American society.
Absolutely. It was a threat to their faith, their way of life, their government, everything. And they weren't quiet about it either. They gave fiery sermons, wrote pamphlets, all warning about these infidel philosophers. That was their term for, Enlightenment thinkers, anyone who questioned traditional religious ideas, and these Illuminati emissaries who were spreading dangerous revolutionary ideas throughout the New World.
I can imagine that had quite an effect on people.
Oh, yeah, it did. It created this wave of fear and anxiety, very similar to what was happening in Europe. And, it got so bad that it actually started influencing politics.
Really? How so?
Well, it became a factor in the 1800 presidential election. The whole Illuminati thing was actually used as a political weapon.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. So this conspiracy theory, this fear, it was shaping real-world events, even in America.
It was. It shows you how powerful these kinds of anxieties can be. how they can influence people's thinking, even in something as important as an election.
Now, you mentioned that there was an interesting episode involving George Washington himself.
Right. It's really fascinating, actually.
So what was Washington's take on all of this? How did he react to these claims about the Illuminati?
So in October of 1798, Washington receives a letter from a guy who's really concerned about this whole Illuminati thing.
Okay, so he's hearing about this from people who are worried.
Exactly. And his response is really insightful, I think. He acknowledges that the doctrines of the Illuminati, the ideas, had spread to the U.S. He doesn't deny that. But he also says that he doesn't believe American Masonic lodges, the Freemasons, that they've collectively adopted those, quote, diabolical tenets.
So he's drawing this distinction. He's saying, yeah, the ideas are out there, but I don't think there's this organized conspiracy within groups like the Freemasons.
Exactly. He's separating the ideas from the supposed organization. And his response, coming from him, this respected figure, it really helped calm people down.
Yeah, I can see that. If Washington isn't panicking, maybe things aren't so bad.
Exactly. And by 1799, the next year, that intense fear had started to die down. And it's really telling, I think, that someone like Washington felt the need to address this, even if he was ultimately dismissing the idea of a widespread conspiracy.
It shows you how seriously people were taking it, right? Even Washington felt like he had to respond.
Yeah, it was that big of a deal.
Okay, so we see these scares in Europe, in America, and then they sort of fade away. But the Illuminati story, it doesn't just disappear, does it? It keeps coming back.
It's really incredible how resilient this legend has been.
So how did the idea of the Illuminati manage to, stick around and evolve through the 19th and 20th centuries? What kept it alive?
Well, even though the Bavarian Illuminati was officially gone, shut down back in the 1780s, and even though a lot of the immediate fears surrounding it died down, the legend didn't disappear. It was like this seed that was planted, and it kept popping up in different forms, different places.
Especially during times of big change, right?
Exactly. When things were chaotic, when there was a lot of upheaval, that's when the Illuminati narrative would often resurface.
It's like it provided a kind of convenient explanation for things that were hard to understand.
Yeah, like a scapegoat, a way to make sense of the chaos.
Can you give us some examples of when this Illuminati narrative popped up again later on?
Sure, let's take the revolutions of 1848.
Okay, those are huge.
Massive, right, all across Europe. And guess what? A lot of the conservative groups at the time started talking about a, quote, Illuminati Masonic plot. They were saying that these uprisings were all orchestrated, that they were all connected, and that the Illuminati were behind it.
So the same playbook from the French Revolution, just being applied to a new set of events.
Exactly. And it shows you that this kind of thinking, it can stick around for a long time.
It does seem like whenever there's a big societal disruption, it becomes fertile ground for these kinds of theories to sprout up again.
Totally. And then as we move into the late 19th century, things get even more interesting.
Okay, what happens then?
So you have people like Nesta H. Webster.
Oh yeah, she wrote a lot about secret societies.
She did. And she was very influential in spreading these ideas about the Illuminati, this time linking them to things like the rise of socialism.
Okay, so now the Illuminati are being blamed for even broader historical movements.
They are. And then this is also when we see the emergence of the protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh, that's a whole other rabbit hole, right?
It is, and it's a really dangerous and harmful one. But what's interesting is that it also kind of folds in this idea of the Illuminati.
So even though the protocols were primarily anti-Semitic, they also played into these fears of secret groups manipulating world events.
They did. And what you start to see is this blending, this merging of different threats into one big overarching conspiracy.
Like the Illuminati, Jewish financiers, Freemasons, they all get kind of lumped together.
Exactly. And they get blamed for all sorts of things, like World War I, for example.
So the Illuminati's supposed reach and influence, it just keeps expanding.
It does. And this trend continued all the way through the 20th century. During Nazi Germany, for example, Nazi propaganda often lumped the Freemasons and the Illuminati together, portraying them as these subversive elements that were trying to weaken the state.
Oh, wow.
And even later, people started attributing things like World War II, the creation of the UN, the Cold War, all these major global events to the hidden machinations of the Illuminati.
But it's crucial to remember, as we've been saying, that there's no real historical evidence linking the actual Bavarian Illuminati to any of these later events, right?
None whatsoever. It's purely speculative.
It's more about the idea of the Illuminati, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the key. The specific historical group, the one that existed in Bavaria, it kind of fades away. But the concept of the Illuminati, the idea of this shadowy, controlling force, it keeps evolving. It adapts to new anxieties, new fears. It becomes this boogeyman almost that could be used to explain whatever people are afraid of at the time.
Right, so it's not so much about the Illuminati themselves anymore, it's about the idea, the symbol of, like, hidden power and manipulation.
Exactly. The name has become shorthand for this whole set of fears about who's really in control. And it's really powerful because it's so adaptable. You can plug it into almost any situation.
That's a great point. And that really brings us to the modern era, doesn't it? How has this Illuminati conspiracy theory transformed in the world we live in today? How does it show up now?
So in the present day, the Illuminati has basically become, I would argue, the most popular, the most pervasive conspiracy theory out there, what we call the New World Order, or NWO.
Okay, and that's the one that most people are probably familiar with today, right?
Right.
The one you see all over the internet, and movies, music, it's everywhere.
Everywhere. It's gone totally mainstream.
So what are the main ideas behind this new world order, this modern version of the Illuminati conspiracy?
Okay, so the core belief is that there's this secret elite, and they're the ones who are really running the show. They're pulling the strings, manipulating global affairs, everything. And their goal is to create a one-world government.
And they're often seen as being directly connected to, or even descendants of, the original Illuminati, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. Like it's this unbroken lineage, this ancient conspiracy that's been passed down through the generations.
Okay, so this elite group, this NWO, they're trying to create this one world government. But how? Like, what are they supposedly doing to make that happen?
So they believe that this cabal, this elite, has control over basically everything important. International banking, all the big institutions, politics, and of course they control the media. That's a big one.
Yeah, got to control the narrative, right?
Right. And their plan is to use all of this power to like slowly erode national sovereignty, make countries weaker, and also to destroy traditional values, break down the old ways of doing things.
So it's all about control, ultimately. Control over everything.
Yeah, total control. And when you think about it, it's a pretty powerful idea, right? It taps into this fear that a lot of people have, this feeling that things are getting out of control, that someone else is making all the decisions.
It's like the ultimate they conspiracy, right? They are controlling everything.
Totally. And that idea, it's incredibly appealing to some people.
Now, when did this modern version of the Illuminati theory, this NWO thing, really start to gain traction? When did it really take off?
It really blew up in the second half of the 20th century.
Okay, why then? What was happening that made people so receptive to this idea?
I think it was a combination of things. You had the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s.
Right, when people were questioning authority, experimenting with new ideas, all that.
Exactly. That created this climate of like skepticism towards traditional institutions, towards the government, towards authority in general. And there was also this growing interest in like secret societies, hidden knowledge, all that kind of stuff.
Right, people were looking for alternative explanations, alternative ways of understanding the world.
Yeah. And then at the same time, you had all this anxiety on the political right.
Okay, like what kind of anxiety?
Well, groups like the John Birch Society,
Okay, I've heard of them. They were like really anti-communist.
extremely anti-communist. And they had these strong anti-elitist sentiments, too.
They didn't trust the government. They didn't trust the, quote, elites.
They didn't trust anyone they saw as being in power. And all of this distrust of authority, this fear of communism, it kind of blended together with these emerging conspiracy theories.
And the Illuminati became this like perfect symbol for all of that.
Exactly. They became the symbol of the hidden enemy, the puppet masters, the ones who were really controlling everything.
And there were some pretty influential books that came out around this time too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like Gary Allen's Men Dare Call It Conspiracy in 1971.
Okay.
And Pat Robertson's The New World Order in 1991. Those books were huge.
And they basically spelled out this whole Illuminati NWO theory.
Yeah, they took all these different pieces, all these suspicions, all these anxieties, and they kind of weaved them together into this big, coherent narrative.
And they explicitly connected real-world institutions, like the Federal Reserve or the UN, to this supposed Illuminati master plan.
They did. They named names, pointed fingers, the whole 9 yards.
And who are the main suspects, the people who are often identified as being part of this modern-day Illuminati?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but generally it's a lot of current and former political leaders, people in finance, influential families, celebrities.
Celebrities?
Oh, yeah, celebrities are a big part of it these days.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, what kind of evidence do people who believe in this NWO theory actually point to? Like, what makes them think that this is all real?
They focus on a lot of different things, like the Eye of Providence on the dollar bill.
Oh, yeah, that one's a classic.
It is. They see that as a symbol of the Illuminati, of their watchful eye over everything. And they point to all these secretive meetings of international organizations like the Bilderberg Group.
Right. That one's always shrouded in secrecy.
Exactly. So that feeds into the conspiracy, right? Because it seems like there's something to hide.
And it's not just symbols and secret meetings. They also interpret major world events, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Things like 9/11, financial crises, even the pandemic, they see all of that as part of the Illuminati's plan. Like, it's all orchestrated to create chaos, to weaken countries, to control the population.
But again, it's all interpretation and speculation, right? There's no actual verifiable evidence connecting any of this to the Illuminati.
Right. These are all just theories, interpretations of events. They're not facts.
But the thing is, despite all that, belief in this Illuminati-led NWO is really widespread today.
It is. It's huge online. There are entire websites, YouTube channels, forums, all dedicated to this stuff.
And it's not just harmless internet fun either. It can have real-world consequences, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, the FBI and other agencies, they've warned about how this kind of rhetoric can lead to violence. There have been cases where people who believed in this stuff have actually committed crimes, because they thought they were fighting against this supposed evil cabal.
That's a good point. It's easy to dismiss it all as just, silly conspiracy theories, but it can actually be dangerous when it spills over into real-world actions.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that ideas have consequences, even ideas that we might think are outlandish or absurd.
Totally. So we've talked about this more serious side of the Illuminati conspiracy, but it's also become this huge pop culture thing, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's everywhere. Movies, music, memes.
And a lot of it, especially in recent years, seems to be focused on celebrities.
Totally.
Like, what's the deal with all these celebrities in the Illuminati?
Well, there's this whole idea that, to really make it big, to achieve superstardom, you have to join the Illuminati.
Okay. And that explains what? Like, how do they connect that to celebrities?
So they'll look at things like, hand gestures that celebrities make.
Like Jay-Z's triangle symbol.
Exactly. Or when someone covers one eye in a photo, that kind of thing.
Right.
And they'll intermit it as secret Illuminati symbols.
Right. Right. And they analyze lyrics, too, don't they?
Oh, yeah, big time. They'll pick apart every line, looking for hidden messages, occult references, all sorts of stuff.
And music videos, too.
Definitely. They'll break down the imagery, the symbolism, looking for clues that the artist is, like sending a secret message or, revealing their Illuminati membership.
I've seen some of those breakdowns online, and they can get pretty elaborate.
They can. Some people take this stuff very seriously. Like, they'll analyze award show performances.
I remember seeing one about Beyoncé's Super Bowl halftime show.
Oh, for sure. That's a classic. Or like Madonna's stage costumes, anything that might even remotely hint at, like pentagrams or all-seeing eyes.
Right, right. It becomes this whole, code to decipher.
It does. And the narrative often gets really dark, too. They'll say that the Illuminati requires sacrifices from its members.
Oh, wow.
Or that they force celebrities to put subliminal messages in their work, to brainwash the masses.
Right, right. And there are some truly wild theories out there.
Oh, for sure. Like the one about Jennifer Hudson's family being murdered as an Illuminati sacrifice.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that one. That's awful.
Awful. And totally unsubstantiated. But again, it goes back to this idea that they need to control everything, even the most personal aspects of people's lives.
Right. It's all part of the grand conspiracy. But of course, we have to remember that all of this, as far as anyone can tell, is completely made up.
Yeah. There's no evidence to support any of it.
But it is kind of fascinating, in a way, to see how this idea of the Illuminati has been repurposed into this, pop culture phenomenon.
It's a meme now, right?
Yeah, totally. Illuminati confirmed. I mean, everyone's heard that.
It's become a joke, but it also shows you how deeply ingrained this idea is in our culture.
Right. It's become so familiar that we can joke about it. And it's not just memes either. It's in books, movies, even games.
Oh, yeah. Like the Illuminatus trilogy.
Right. Or that card game.
The card game. I mean, it's everywhere.
And those fictional portrayals, they can kind of blur the lines, can't they? Like, for some people, it might be hard to separate what's real from what's made up.
I think that's true. It makes it harder to have these conversations, to really get at the truth of what the Illuminati were and what they weren't.
Because the myth has become so big, so dominant, that it kind of overshadows everything else.
It does. But that's also what makes it so interesting to study. It's like this window into how our culture works, how ideas spread, how we try to make sense of the world.
It's a really powerful example of the enduring power of myth, right?
Absolutely.
So beyond just the celebrity stuff, how does this Illuminati thing play out in, the actual conspiracy communities online, like the people who really believe in this stuff?
Well, the Illuminati is kind of like a common thread that runs through a lot of different conspiracy theories. It's like a connecting point.
Okay, like what kind of connections, what other theories do we see it linked to?
Well, QAnon, for example.
Oh, right.
They might not always use the name Illuminati specifically, but they have this very similar idea of a hidden cabal, this deep state that's running everything. And they often portray them as Satan worshippers, which is a common theme in a lot of these theories.
So it's like they're taking the core elements of the Illuminati conspiracy and plugging them into this new framework.
They are. And then you also see a lot of overlap with, like, UFO theories and paranormal stuff.
Like aliens are working with the Illuminati to control the world.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Or that the Illuminati are members of ancient secret societies that have been around for centuries.
Right.
Like they'll blend all sorts of different ideas together.
You mentioned the reptilian shapeshifters theory earlier.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
How does that one fit into all of this?
Well, that's David Icke's theory, right?
Right.